The Abraham Lincoln murder case. Rick Norwood, straight out of Cone Jeets. Abraham Lincoln murdered by a woman. The news flashed to London via heliograph in a matter of hours. Early the next morning, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson boarded the dirigible for America. The Secret Service filled the great detective in as to the facts of the case. A handsome, well-dressed woman had been seen standing behind the president in his box. She took a pistol from her purse, fired one shot, and fled. Within minutes, the Secret Service had sealed all of the exits from Ford's Theater. But in spite of the most thorough search, the woman was not to be found. "There is nothing here for you, Holmes," said the head of the Secret Service. "We know who the woman is." She introduced herself to several members of the acting company earlier in the evening. She said that her name was Trudy and that she was the girlfriend of the famous actor John Wilkes Booth. Of course, never heard of her. She used his name to gain entrance to the theater. "Well, Watson, we may as well return to London," said Holmes. "You're not giving up," Watson exclaimed. "Hardly. I've solved the case." "Solved it? How?" "Come, Watson?" "It's elementary. Booth is Trudy and Trudy, Booth. That's all I know and all I need to know."
A dozen of everything. Marion Zimmer, Bradley. What counts is what you mean. When Marcy unwrapped the cut glass bottle, she thought it was perfume. "Oh, fine," she said to herself sardonically. "Here I am, being married in 4 days, and without a rag to wear, and Aunt Hepzibah sends me perfume." It wasn't that Marcy was mercenary, but Aunt Hepzibah was, as the vulgar expression puts it, rolling in dough, and she spent about $40 a year. She lived in Egypt, in a little mud hut, because, as she said, she wanted to soak up the flavour of the East in large capitals. She wrote Marcia, who was her only living relative, long, incoherent letters about the beauty of the Orient and the delights of contemplation. Letters which Marcy dutifully read and as dutifully answered with "Dear Aunt Hepzibah, I hope you are well." She sighed and examined the label, printed in a careful, vague Arabic script. It read, "Gin No. 7. Marcy shrugged. "Oh well," she thought, "it's probably very chai and expensive. If I go without lunch this week, I can manage to get myself a fancy negligee and maybe a pair of new gloves to wear to the church. Greg will like the perfume, and if I keep my job for a few months after we're married, we'll get along. Of course, Emily Post says that a bride should have a dozen of everything, but we can't all be lucky." She started to put the perfume into her desk drawer, for her lunch hour was almost over then. On an impulse, she began carefully to work the stopper loose. "I'll just take a tiny sniff," she thought. The stopper stuck. Marcy twitched, pulled, chucked at the curious, pervasive fragrance which stole out. "It sure is strong," she thought, holding the loosened stopper in her hand. Then blinked and dropped it to the floor, where the precious cut glass shattered into million pieces. Marcy was a normal child of her generation, which is to say, she went to the movies regularly. She had seen Sinbad the Sailor and The Thief of Baghdad, so, of course, she knew immediately what was happening, as the pervasive fragrance rolled out and coalesced into a huge, towering figure with a vaguely oriental face. "My gosh," she breathed, then as she noticed imminent peril to the office ceiling, directed, "Hey, stick your head out the window quick." "To hear is to obey," said the huge figure sibilantly. "But, oh mistress, if I might venture to make a suggestion that might attract attention." "Permit me," and he promptly shrank to a less generous proposition. "They don't make palaces as big these days, do they?" he asked confidentially. "They certainly do not," gulped Marcy. Are you a genie?" "I am not," the figure said with asperity. "Can't you read?" "I am a gin No. 7 to be exact." You mean you have to grant me my wish?" The djinn scowled. "Now, there is a strange point of ethics," he murmured. "Since the stopper on the bottle is broken, I can't ever be shut up again. At the same time, since you go generously let me out, I shall gladly grant you a wish. What will it be? Maurice didn't even hesitate. Here was a chance to make a good wedding present out of Aunt Hepzibah's nutty old bottle, and after all, she wasn't a greedy girl. She smiled brilliantly. I'm being married in a few days, she started. You want an elixir of love? Of eternal beauty? No, sir, E. Marcy shuddered. She had read the Arabian Nights when she was a little girl. She knew you could not make a magical bargain with a genie-ear djinn. No. As a matter of fact, I just want, well, a household trousseau. Nice things to be married in, and that kind of thing just to start us off nicely. I'm afraid I don't quite understand. The djinn frowned. Trousseau? That word has come in since my time. Remember, I haven't been out of this bottle since King Solomon was in diapers. Well sheets and towels and slips and night groans Marcy began, then dismissed it. Oh well, just give me a dozen of everything, she told him. To hear is to obey, the djinn intoned. When shall I put it, oh mistress? Oh, in my room, Marcy told him then, remembering the $5 a week hall bedroom. Maybe you'll have to enlarge the room a little, but you can do that, can't you? Oh sure, said the djinn casually. A djinn, my dear mistress, can do anything. And now, farewell forever, and thank you for letting me out. He vanished so swiftly that Marcy rubbed her eyes, and the little cut-glass bottle fell to the floor. After a moment, Marcy picked it up, sniffing at the empty bottle. A curious faint fragrance still clung to it, but it was otherwise empty. Did I dream this whole thing? She asked herself dizzily. The buzzer rang, and the other typist in the office came back to their desks. Gosh, someone asked, have you been sitting here all during lunch hour, Marcy? I took a little nap, Marcy answered, and carefully palmed the cut grass bottle into her desk drawer. That afternoon seemed incredibly long to Marcy. The hands of the clock lagged as they inched around the dial, and she found herself beginning one business letter. She ripped it out, angrily typed the date on a second letterhead, and started over. Gentlemen, we wish to call your attention. Finally, the hands reached 5, and Marcy, whisking a cover over her typewriter, clutched her handbag and literally ran from the office. There won't be anything there, she kept telling herself, as she walked rapidly down the block. There won't be anything, but suppose there was, suppose. The hall of the rooming house was ominously quiet. Marcy ascended the stairs, wondering at the absence of the landlady, the lack of noise from the other boarders. A curious reluctance dragged at her hands as she thrust her key into the lock. It's all nonsense, she said aloud. Here goes. She shut her eyes and opened the door. There was a dozen of everything. The room extended into grey space, and Marcy, opening her eyes, caught her hands to her throat to stifle a scream. There were a dozen of her familiar bed, a dozen grey cats snoozing on the pillow, a dozen dainty negligees piled carefully by it, a dozen delicate packages labelled nylon stockings, and a dozen red apples rolling slightly beside them. Before her staring eyes, a dozen elephants lumbered through the grey space, and beyond, her terrified vision focused on a dozen white domes that faded into the dim spaces of the expanded room, and a dozen tall cathedrals as well. A dozen of everything. Marcy, Marcy, where are you? She heard a man's voice shouting from the hall. Marcy whirled. Greg! And he was outside this nightmare. She fled blindly, stumbling over a dozen rolled-up Persian carpets, grazing the edge of one of a dozen grand pianos. She screamed, visualizing a dozen rattlesnakes somewhere. Greg, she shrieked. 12 doors were flung violently open. Marcy, sweetheart, what's the matter? Pleaded a jumble of tender voices, and 12 of Greg, pushing angrily at one another, rushed into the room.
The Anatomy lesson by Scott Sanders. Surely there's the right to assemble in peace. By the time I reached the anatomy library, all the bones had been checked out. Students bent over the wooden boxes everywhere, in hallways and snack bar, assembling feet and arms, scribbling diagrams in notebooks. Half the chairs were occupied by slouching skeletons, and reclining skeletons littered the tables like driftwood. Since I also would be examined on the subject the next day, I asked the librarian to search one last time for bone boxes in the storeroom. "But I tell you, they're all given out," she said, glaring at me from beneath an enormous snarl of dark hair, like a fierce animal caught in a bush. How many students had already pestered her for bones this evening? I persisted. "Medical school rides on this grade. Haven't you got any damaged skeletons? Irregulars?" Ignoring my smile, she measured me with her fierce stare, as if estimating the size of box my bones would fill after she had made supper of me. A shadow dropped me beneath each of her eyes, permanent sorrow, like the tear mark of a clown. "Irregulars," she repeated, turning away from the counter. I blinked with relief at her departing back. Only as she slipped nonno isolinto he storeroom did I notice her gloved hands. Fastidious, I thought. Doesn't want to soil herself with bone dust and mildew. While awaiting my specimens, I studied the vertebrae which knobbed through the bent necks of the students all around me, each one laboring over fragments of skeletons. 5 lumbar vertebrate, 7 cervical, a round dozen thoracic. I rehearsed the names, my confidence building. Presently the librarian returned with a box. It was the size of an orange crate, wooden, dingy, from age or dry rot. The metal clasp that held it shut were tarnished a sickly green. No wonder she wore the gloves. "This one's for restricted use," she announced, shoving it over the counter. I hesitated, my hands posed above the crate as if I were testing it for heat. "Well, do you want it, or don't you?" she said. Afraid she would return it to the archives, I pounced on it with one hand and with the other signed a borrower's card. "Old model?" I inquired pleasantly. She did not smile. I turned away with the box in my arms. The burden seemed lighter than its bulk would have promised, as if the wood had dried with age. Perhaps instead of bones inside there would be pyramids of dust. The metal clasps felt cold against my fingers. After some searching I found a clear space on the floor beside a scrawny man whose elbows and knees protruded through rents in his clothing like so many lumps of a sea serpent above the waters. When I tugged at the clasps they yielded reluctantly. The hinges opened with a gritty shriek, rising for a moment all round me a dozen glazed eyes, which soon returned to their studies. Inside I found the usual wooden trays for bones, light as bird wings, but instead of the customary lining of vinyl, they were covered with a metal the color of copper and the puttyish consistency of lead. Each bone fitted into its pocket of metal. Without consulting notes, I started confidently on the foot, joining tarsal to metatarsal. But it was soon evident that there were too many bones. Each one seemed a bit odd shape, with an extra flange where none should be, or a socket at right angles to the orthodox position. The only way of accommodating all the bones was to assemble them into a 7-toed monstrosity, slightly larger than the foot of an adult male, phalanges all of the same length, with ankle bones bearing the unmistakable nodes for what? Wings? Flippers? This drove me back to my anatomy text. But no consulting of diagrams would make sense of this foot. A practiced scrape of my knife blade assured me there were real bones. But from what freakish creature? Feeling vaguely guilty, as if in my ignorance I have given birth to a monstrosity, I looked around the library to see if anyone had noticed. Everywhere living skulls bent studiously to be watching me sidelong, through her tangled hair. I hastily scattered the foot bones to their various compartments. Next I worked at the hand, which boasted 6 rather than 7 digits. 2 of them were clearly thumbs, opposite in their orientation, and each of the remaining fingers was double-jointed, so that both sides of these vanished hands would have served as palms. At the wrist a socket opened in one direction, a ball joint protruded in other, as if the hand were meant to snap onto an adjoining one. I now bent secretively over my outrageous skeleton, unwilling to meet stares from other students. After tinkering with fibula and clavicle, each bone recognizable but slightly awry from the human, I gingerly unpacked the plates of the skull. I had been fearing these bones most of all. Their scattered state was unsettling enough to begin with, since in ordinary skeletal kits, they would have been assembled into a brain case. Their gathered state was even more unsettling. They would only go together in one arrangement, yet it appeared so outrageous to me that I forced myself to reassemble the skull 3 times. There was only one jaw, to be sure, though an exceedingly broad one, and only 2 holes for ears. But the skull itself was clearly double, as if 2 heads had been squeezed together, like cherries grown double on one stem. Each hemisphere of the brain enjoyed its own cranium. The opening for the nose was in its accustomed place, as were 2 of the eyes. But in the center of the vast forehead, like the drain in an empty expanse of bathtub, was the socket for a 3rd eye. I closed the anatomy text, helpless before this freak. Hunched over to shield it from the gaze of the other students, I stared long at that triangle of eyes, and at the twinned craniums that splayed out behind like fusion of moons. No, I decided, such a creature was not possible. It was a hoax, a malicious joke designed to shatter my understanding of anatomy. But I would not fall for the trick. Angrily I disassembled this counterfeit skull, stuffed the bones back into their metal pockets, clasped the box shut and returned it to the counter. "This may seem funny to you," I said, "but I have an examination to pass." "Funny," the librarian replied. "This hoax." I slapped the box, raising a pud of dust. When she only lifted an eyebrow mockingly, I insisted, "It's a fabrication, an impossibility." "Is it?" she taunted, laying her gloved hands atop the crate. "Furious," I said, "it's not even a very good hoax. No one who knows the smallest scrap of anatomy would fall for it." "Really," she said, peeling the glove away from one wrist. I wanted to shout at her and then hurry away, before she could uncover that hand. Yet I was mesmerized by the slide cloth, the pinkish skin emerging. I found it hard to believe myself, at first, she said, spreading the naked hand before me, palm up. I was relieved to count only 5 fingers' digits. But the fleshy heel was inflamed and swollen, as if the bud of a new thumb were sprouting there. A scar, I thought feverishly. Nothing awful. Then she turned the hand over and displayed for me another palm. The fingers curled upward, the curled in the reverse direction, forming a cage of fingers on the counter. I flinched away. Skeletons were shattering in my mind, names of bones were fluttering away like blown leaves. All my cheerfully gathered knowledge was scattering. Unable to look at her, unwilling to glimpse the socket of flesh that might be opening on her forehead beneath the dangling hair, I kept my gaze turned aside. "How many of you are there?" I hissed. "I'm the first, so far as I know." "Unless you count our friend here," she added, rapping her knuckles against the bone box. I guess the distances to inhabited planets conjured up the silhouettes of spacecraft. "But where do you come from?" "Boise." "Boise, Idaho?" "Well, actually, I grew up on a beet farm just outside Boise." "You mean you're—" I pointed one index finger at her and shoved the other against my chest. "Human?" "Of course." She laughed, a quick sound like release of bubbles underwater. Students at nearby tables gazed up momentarily from their skeletons with bleary eyes. The librarian lowered her voice until it burbled like whale song. "I'm as human as you are," she murmured. "But your hands?" "Your face." "Until a few months ago they were just run-of-the-mill human hands." She drew the glove quickly on and touched her swollen cheeks. "My face was skinny. My shoes used to fit. Then what happened? I assembled these bones." Again she rapped on the crate. From inside came a hollow clattering, like the sound of gravel sliding. "You're becoming one of them." "So it appears." Her upturned lips and downturned eyes gave me contradictory messages. The clown-sad eye seemed too far apart. Even buried under its shrubbery of dark hair, her forehead seemed impossibly broad. "Aren't you frightened?" I said. "Not anymore," she answered. "Not since my head began to open." I winced, recalling the vast skull, pale as porcelain, and the triangle of eyes. I touched the bone box gingerly. "What is it?" "I don't know yet. But I begin to get glimmering, begin to see it, alive and flying." "Flying?" "Swimming, maybe. My vision's still too blurry. For now, I just think of it as a skeleton of the possible, a fossil of the future." I tried to imagine her ankles affixed with wings, her head swollen like a double moon, her third eye glaring. And what sort of creature will you be when you're challenged? We'll just have to wait and see, won't we? We'll just have to wait and see, won't we? We? Lechoed, backing carefully over the linoleum. I stared at my palms, then turned my hands over to examine the twitching skin where the knuckles should be.